Welcome to The New Next, a podcast that addresses current events and how they will impact the future. Co-hosted by the inquisitive public speaking champion, Mike McVeigh, and energy, economics, and technology expert, Matt Jensen. Join us as we explore all things energy, economic, tech, and political, and how they will affect our future. Anyway, we have a pretty broad inflation outside of just housing and cars. Is the Fed policy really that effective right now?
Yeah, so there's been some Federal Reserve research reports recently released. One out of San Francisco, and then one out of the Kansas City Fed, and they basically tried to measure the effects of inflation related to demand, like excess demand caused from like stimulus payments and stuff like that, and really kind of like the supply shocks side. What they found is, yes, demand is a pretty big driver over the historical average right now, but the supply shocks are approximately twice as strong as that. So the supply shocks really relate to kind of like COVID-19 related stuff, pushing out all that money, kind of making it rain, and people just buying stuff that wasn't necessarily utilized very well. The effect on shipping. So if you're buying like tons and tons of masks, that displaces goods that would have been in that shipping containers there before.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact of the matter is, at least in the US, we buy, and Europe too, we buy tons of goods from China and other lower cost countries where they have to be put on ships and taken over here. So where shipping rates had crashed in years before and they were scrapping ships, basically selling it for scrap metal because they were uneconomic, you went to a point where shipping rates became the highest in forever. So there's also been a lot of effects of China's COVID zero policy, where they essentially are shutting down parts of their industry and like ports and stuff like that, where goods are not able to get out, and you kind of have a break in the economy there. And you've really had globalization for a long time make these goods really seem really cheap, where you were kind of like companies would bounce from country to country if they could save a couple bucks off their goods. And as consumers, you receive the benefits from that. But when the whole transportation supply lines started to break down, it basically added all these costs back in. And you had politicians and companies really talk about how do you reshore production of goods and goods close to where the consumers are. But for the most part, unless there's technological effects, the labor typically makes up a large percentage of our goods and services, and a lot of those would be more expensive if produced here. So, I mean, it's demand has been stimulated, or inflation has been stimulated. These Fed papers found by the additional funds going to people and basically increasing their ability, kind of a quick cash. So, but the cost elements have been a much larger driver from the inflation
right
over the past couple of years.
Cool. So not that this specific point is going to reflect my natural thoughts as much. However, generally speaking, I would put myself, generally speaking, in the camp of Elizabeth Warren when it comes to fiscal issues. And I'm not going to pretend that I understand everything. And I'm probably, having talked to you now for the past 6 months, I'm probably less in that camp than I was 6 months ago. Um, but and I don't think this is anything new. I know this is probably one of our more potentially divisive sections. Um, this next person I'm going to mention, I'm not necessarily a fan of or against. I know their background, and I know that they've definitely targeted Bush and Trump in particular for their things, though at least to this person's credit, he's kind of attacked Biden just as much. And I don't think he attacked Obama super much during his time, but Robert Reich, he was one of the like financial secretaries or something under Clinton, I believe, if I remember correctly, or something to do with financial stuff, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so one of my friends on Instagram um, usually post different quotes are from Robert Reich's Twitter account. And because I knew we were going to be potentially talking about inflation this week, I went ahead and sent this to you. And this one, I don't like this one as much because, and I feel like I have to say this because there's some things that he says that I really want to be like, hey, Matt, so tell me this. This one, for the most part, it does feel like a setup, and it's almost a straw man or a paper tiger kind of thing. So I already can see that that's what's going on in this question. So don't I'm not defending this specific stance. Okay. That's all I want to say. So Robert Reich said, why is no one talking about the real inflationary impact of a $768 billion defense budget, or corporate subsidies, or tax cuts for the rich? It's almost as if it's not about inflation at all. Thinky face. Not to be confused with thinking face. Um, so, and I think I understand some of it, but why is nobody talking about the inflationary impact of a $768 billion defense budget?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, just off the top of the head, like uh, economics before it was just called economics was called political economics or political economy.
Oh, really?
So I think you have back in the Adam Smith times. So I think this is a good example of it because it's kind of like one of those things where it's you can see right off the bat what he supports from the statement, right?
Yeah. Um,
Which
well, let me ask.
what
Go. I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I am. Um, what is there a different? Like, was last year's military budget tremendously less than the 768 billion that we've done this year? Because if I,
no, it's
yeah,
it's
so
still going up.
this is where I find the faulty logic. I mean, I understand we're spending more every year, but I would argue that, and I know I'm not looking at data, but I've looked at this data before. It's not like our defense budget is going up 20% and inflation is 10%, or it's not going up 10% even though inflation's going up 10%. It's actually going up at a less percentage. And another person I actually have a lot of.
To give him a credit, like it's pretty huge, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Um,
Like we spend, I think, more than the top 10 combined.
yeah, and that argument's a whole other argument that I'm definitely not going to have tonight. I don't have a problem talking about it because this is one. The military budget is divisive for lots of different reasons, and that might be a future show. But um, like one of my favorite TikTokers is a lady who works for NASA, and she breaks down math and science and kind of like I thought at first she was a very extreme liberal person, and then when I saw some of her other stuff, I was like, oh, okay, she's actually like Matt Jensen, fairly balanced. Maybe not has the same opinions, and she mentioned that everybody talks about the defense budget, this defense budget, that, and then she broke it down, and defense budget is either the third or fourth biggest thing that we pay for out of our taxes. It's 13% of our 13 cents out of every dollar we spend, as opposed to again, I know that's high, but we have two or three other things that are actually higher.
Yeah.
So it's, and I'm not saying it's better or worse, not tonight at least. But social things like Social Security and some other stuff take up well over 50 cents of our dollar before we even get to the lowly third or fourth of 13 cents. So, not saying it is or isn't bad. All right, so this one, and the reason why I don't like this specific question, these next two questions, because to me these are not separate for the current inflation issue. These are issues that, like, the same as the defense budget. This is an issue every year and has been an issue every year that I think I've been alive. It's not something new because of, oh, the COVID inflation, the covation. No, anyway, but corporate subsidies and tax cuts for the rich, as well as the defense budget. To me, those aren't new things. Those are issues that, if you believe they're issues, then those are things that we deal with every year, and they're not drastically different right now than they were 4 years ago or 3 years ago before COVID hit. It's just, I mean, I think there was another one I sent you a while ago that talked about the actual amount of money that oil and gas was supposedly making in the midst of this thing. But and then you brought up very clearly that, well, they also lost more than, over the past 2 years, they lost so much money. Them having a run of 3 months where they made money is not really, in the grand scheme, is a lot less than what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And I don't want to defend that statement. And I know that's kind of like, I've already butchered my question, but it was more of a thing of, there's so much crap out there about inflation that is just absolutely wrong. Like, it's the kind of thing of, so back when I was more um, voracious in my religious activities, it would be like, hey, how much did you spend on your video game? Oh, $59.99. Like, do you realize for $59.99 you could feed 3 people in the world for a full year? Yeah, it's like, like, okay, do I go and complain about the fact that you bought Coach or Chanel type
Mhm.
stuff? It's playing a game, but it's like, oh, this is the inflation thing, but it's not the inflation thing. It has nothing to do with inflation, really. It's just some things that are like, hey, I know you like the color green, but I just want you to know there's red out there too. Like, okay, but it's St. Patrick's Day. Yeah, and there's Red Day too. you know,
Yeah.
I know I didn't really
I,
ask you much about it, but I just,
well, my thought generally these days is politics. The discussion around it totally sucks,
mhm.
and it's a lot of people that are trying to make emotional arguments on stuff that we should really have non-emotional discussions about, like what our values are, what do we want. But it's just it's crazy if you try to like follow along these political discussions. Like, it seems like a lot of people are overloading their brains,
Yeah,
and you have a lot of these like simplistic arguments where it's, I don't know. Like, I enjoy listening to Robert Reich speak, but he's definitely
oh yeah,
in that political economist camp, and pretty much anybody that you have that is in that political sphere does have a bent for them, and that's why they're kind of in that position.
in the
So
same
if you're
way,
kind of,
yeah, but in the same way that people are in the other bent have the same,
yeah,
their thing as well.
well, but so you mentioned Elizabeth Warren earlier
Mhm.
too, and she's been so like one of the primary goals that the Federal Reserve is trying to tamper down demand. So that is essentially putting people out of work, right? So she's been like, what's worse, inflation and increasing inflation and increasing unemployment, or just inflation? And uh, I think that um, she's got a good point. It's like, if like we talked about earlier, if a lot of this is supply caused,
Mm-hmm.
and the Federal Reserve's lost a lot of their control over their ability to really adjust that, so that the housing market definitely is in looking like it's in a recession right now. The technology kind of like growth stocks have lost tons of money. The economy more broadly has really I'd say held up a little bit, but you're making these broad decisions off of numbers that we've kind of talked about a lot of different metrics where there's maybe two or three entities that measure them, or different ways of looking at things. And it's her point is like, why are you pushing us into a recession? And that's a reasonable argument to have. On the job side too, there's there's the establishment survey, which is kind of like a high level measurement of jobs in the economy, and then there's the household survey. And what we've seen in um, the employment statistics is that the job market is a lot softer than the high level kind of roll up numbers really suggest.
Right.
You've seen a lot of people go into multiple jobs with part-time employment,
Mm-hmm.
and full-time employment is kind of like lagging, especially in kind of like professional services and stuff like that. So wages are up, but I think a lot of that's driven by um, restaurant workers and stuff like that. So it's a hard thing managing the beast of the economy, but I think a lot of people would like to keep the money flowing. So
And
there's,
I know we have
you
some.
may agree or not, but that's a reasonable position to have.
I do think it's complicated, and I don't think it's, as you mentioned. Sometimes we try to simplify things, and by that, and the simplifying as a whole is not bad, but when we oversimplify it, we're leaving out variables and things that definitely change the whole perspective and stuff. And this is the question I was going to ask you earlier. I know we have a couple more prepared questions, but I think this kind of, we're kind of getting to the heart of where my concern is. Um, so the last great inflation time, I don't know when it was. I remember seeing a lot of reports about the 80s.
70s.
Okay, was it the 70s? Because I heard during Reagan's presidency there was a really bad inflation thing going on as well. I know the one in the 70s
Right.
that you're talking about, but
Yeah. So when Reagan, basically, so there's this output gap, and you try to kind of try to the economists try to specify what the inflation rate should be to kind of meet at this optimum level of the economy without going too high and basically overshooting that.
mm-hmm.
The output gap was misspecified in the 60s and 70s. So they had way more inflation driven from easier monetary policy than they should have. And when Reagan came to office, him and Paul Volcker, who was the Federal Reserve chairman, basically killed inflation.
Okay,
And
so his was more of
so
a recession thing than an inflation thing.
yeah, so the
Okay,
70s you saw stagflation, where you had a lack of growing economy, but
okay.
also inflation, and then you a bunch of oil price shocks too.
So my question is, and I ground this with the things of, because of technology, I understand no matter what, the average person has a better life right now in certain amenities, um, but are we actually that much wealthier, or are we actually like the inflation issues of the 70s? Um, in some ways, I feel like we're dealing with the exact same thing. I mean, obviously it's inflation, but like we might have more money behind our paychecks. Um, we might
Yeah.
have some other stuff, but it feels like ultimately maybe billionaires now would have just been 100 millionaires in the 70s, or something. But it doesn't. For me, it feels like we might change what the number says, but ultimately the gap between the haves and the have-nots isn't really, maybe it's a little bit bigger, but for the most part it's about the same. And so the inflation and stuff, it hits me in my position of life the same way as it would have hit in the 70s, save for a couple factors both ways. Like gas was a bigger issue, obviously, um, when there was no gas at the gas pumps and stuff. Um, um, but because of that, we've also made amends where we shouldn't ever go through another situation like that quite the same way. Um, so, like, I'm asking you, in your opinion, do you feel like more or less it's the same? I mean, there are obviously differences that have been accommodated for, but do you feel like the gap is basically still the same? Like the effects of inflation, that if you're in the bottom 10% or the top 10%, you're pretty much in the same place you would have been if you would have, or the middle 80% that you would have been 50 years ago or 48
Well,
years ago.
that's a very complicated story. So,
Yes, drink to that, people.
But generally, maybe this will help say it. So when you have low interest rates and you're essentially a saver, so you earn wages and then you leave that in a savings account, like, you get basically 0% on your money. So by keeping it in a savings account, your buying power of that money goes down every year. And that pushes people into risk assets. So equities, real estate, stuff like that, where essentially you can either loan money at a lower rate and then invest it in something that's more appreciative, but it doesn't benefit savers. And if you're not saving anything, like you're poor and barely getting by, you don't have money to save into risk assets like your 401k and stuff, and um, basically get the effects of increasing market. So you look at a lot of these uber wealthy people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and stuff. They have publicly traded equities, which are risk assets. And so savers that are incentivized to put it in, or not savers, but well, people that save money are incentivized to put their money into these risk assets because they're going to grow versus the risk-free assets, essentially. So, I mean, that's kind of a way to look at it. Like, I think, yeah, it's people that have excess money or have built up a nest egg, a lot of the boomers over time, or younger people these days that are making really good money as software engineers and stuff and can save a lot, or buying homes in desirable areas like Seattle and being able to hold on to them a long time. They're basically getting a lot of wealth out of that.
Right.
So, Federal Reserve having rates so low where you can borrow money at a very low interest rate and put it into like a house in a place where there's not enough supply. Like a lot of my friends have had their house prices double in the last 5 to 6 years in
Right.
the Seattle area. And that's long-term wealth that, a lot of them are millionaires just in their house now because they bought at the right time and they had the money to put that money down and buy it. And poor people that haven't had enough money and are renters too have just seen their rental costs go up. So they haven't participated in that equity premium. But they are feeling the effects of dwindling buying power because their rent's going up and their wages aren't necessarily going up. So it's, this is a very complicated topic, but that's maybe the easiest way that I can say it. It's always nicer to have more money than it's not. So
right. Well, and this is something we can go in at another time, but that's something that hits closer to home because, um, like, because I work for the government, I generally don't get pay increases even on par with some of the lesser of the, um, the private sector and stuff. So the salary that, I mean, in fact, the salary of my position 10 years ago was exactly the same salary of the position now. It hasn't
wow.
changed at all, save for like there was a state raise for all state employees. I think it was like 1% or 2% or something a couple of years ago. But
It's awful.
um, yeah, uh, and and some of it's inflation, some of it's just cost of business, cost of stuff. But like insurance has gone up every single year that I've worked for the state. I'm about to hit 10 years. The cost of various things have obviously gone up. So in a sense, every time I get a promotion, all I'm doing is basically catching up with stuff. And so that's great for me, but it's not so great necessarily for the people lower down who, and there's some other stuff that I don't really complicate more, but it's just one of those things of where, um, I personally don't like the idea that everybody has to basically be in the private sector doing great stuff just so that way they can be able to pay their monthly bills and stuff. That scares me. I think that's generally a negative thing. Even in,
But you also compare that to California. California, their government employers typically make a lot more money than private sector employees for the same position. So I think
really,
it's kind of a state specific thing. Like we don't have a big government state here. Yeah.
rubbing my beard.
Pick the wrong state.
If you would like to learn more about the New Next podcast, find us at thenewnextpodcast.com, where you can suggest a topic you would like for us to cover. If you enjoyed what you heard, share the podcast, tell a friend about it, or rate us with 5 stars.